invitation without any reluctance. Moving on to the next session to deliver a talk on the topic Dimensions and Research Methodology Exploring Research Prospects in HISTEM, I invite Dr. K. Ashok, Assistant Professor, Department of History, Madras Christian College, Chennai. He bagged the award Teacher Fellowship under the Faculty Development Program during the 12th planned period by the UGC. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much. First and foremost, I thank Professor Ajay Kumar, the Pro Vice Chancellor, University of Kerala, Professor A.K. Prasad, the Director, School of Social Sciences, my good friend, Dr. P. Jinimon, the Head, Department of History, faculty members of Department of History, University of Kerala, the faculty members from other colleges, and student friends. Thank you very much for being here and to listen to my talk on exploring research projects in HISTEM. So I should also thank Dr. Shiba, ma'am, for set the ball rolling. So ma'am was talking about the concept of binary. And generally in academics, we always feel history and sciences. History and sciences, these are two extremes. These are two binaries. So in my talk, I'm going to take up an area which is an upcoming area in the discipline of history. What do you call it as? HISTEM. HISTEM. That is History of Science, Technology, Environment, and Medicine. So let me share my screen. I hope I'm audible. Can anyone respond? Oh, thank
yes,
you
sir.
So much. Yes. Can you please tell me what is there on your screens?
So dimensions in research methodology exploring.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. So this is the topic of my talk today, dimensions in research methodology, exploring research prospects in HISTEM. So before getting into my topic, first, let us understand what is research and what is not research. The word research itself is self-explanatory in nature. Research, a continuous search again and again until you get a satisfying answer. Not only a satisfying answer, an answer which is based on evidences. So this, we call it as research. John W. Best has rightly said, the secret of our cultural development has been research, pushing back the areas of ignorance by discovering new truth, which in turn lead to better ways of doing things and better products. So it is research that has brought us new truths. So the idea of research is to bring or to discover new truth in any discipline. When you know what is research, you should also know the nuances of research. Research is not merely information gathering. So many times, this is what many of our student friends, they do. They just go collect information and they present in a coherent manner. So research is not mere information gathering, not mere transportation of facts from one location to another. And now the new trend has come just by flipping through books and internet. We say that I have got some good materials. So selecting or reading books from the library is not research, nor surfing in the internet is not research. Research requires interpretation of data. Whatever you have collected, whatever you have read, it has to be interpreted, and this interpretation should be based on some sound theory. So as my previous speaker, Dr. Shiba, was talking about this concept of theoretical foundations. So in science, when you talk about science research, they always say that my research is based on some theory. But when it comes to historical research, most of the time, we are in descriptive fashion. And now time has come where there is a shift from the descriptive pattern to an analytical pattern. And the present day research, it requires interpretation of data in an analytical way. So coming to the second basic aspect, we have heard these words, research methods and research methodology. So what is this research method? Research methods are techniques used by scholars to conduct research. I repeat, research methods are techniques used by scholars to conduct research, where research methodology, it explains the method by which a scholar proceeds with the research. The research method is a technique, whereas explaining the research method is nothing but research methodology. So research method aims at finding solutions to research problems. Research methodology aims at adoption of correct procedures to find out solutions. Now, I hope the student friends will understand the terminology, research methods and research methodology. So research methodology is the method by which the scholar wanted to proceed with the research, and it is also the correct procedure by which he can able to come to the solution. So I'm focusing my talk on a new discipline of a sub-discipline in history called HISTEM, HISTEM. So HISTEM is nothing but history of science, technology, environment, and medicine. So this particular field has gained prominence in the last 50 plus years. And there are a lot of research opportunities in this field when compared to the other fields of history, such as political, cultural, and social. HISTEM, history of science, technology, environment, and medicine, has ample of opportunities for us to undertake research. So coming to this HISTEM, what is this HISTEM? So the concept or the base of HISTEM is nothing but science. So the word science, it comes from the Latin word scientia, which means knowledge. And as we all know, whether we like sciences or not, science is part of our life and human history. And most of us in school days, we are not too much into sciences. So we landed up in taking history program. But whether we like or we don't like, science is part of our life and human history. And this particular discipline, history of science, has developed as an academic discipline right from the start of 20th century. So what is this field, history of science and technology? The field, history of science and technology, it's a field of history that examines how the understanding of the natural world and the ability to manipulate it have changed over the millennia. So how man has taken control of the natural world and how he is able to manipulate this nature over the years. And the study of these two things is the core of the history of science and technology. And this field, the field of history of science and technology, it has an impact on the cultural, economic, and political aspects of the human society. So, and this field, it gained prominence after Second World War. So, when compared to the other disciplines of history, HISTEM is a baby. It's almost a baby. It has a growth of only 50 plus years. So, what is this history of science? So, the history of science, it all started with the Greeks. It was the Greeks who talked about science, and they said science is nothing but the desire to know. So if you want to know about something, if you have an inclination to know about something, they called it as science. And later, they called science as a desire for power. So there is a shift from desire to know to desire to power. But whereas ancient Indians, they claimed science as a liberating force. If you know more and more, you can liberate yourselves from the external world. So for ancient Indians, science was hailed as a liberating force. But science, as such, it took a very fast movement right from the time of Enlightenment. And it was Roger Bacon who came out with this popular quote, "Science is nothing but the power to control." So following this ideology, Europe took up sciences and science became a tool of colonialism. And now the science has taken a different form, emergence of national science or decolonized sciences. And this is the history of science. It started from the Greek world, where it started with the desire to know, to desire for power, whereas in India, it was just science was seen as a liberating force, whereas back again in Europe, science was seen as power to control. And this idea of power to control made the European powers to use science as a tool of colonialism. And the history of 18th and 19th and the 20th century world is determined by the advancement of science and technology. So science was used as a powerful tool of colonialism by the European powers to control and to dominate the non-Western countries and cultures. So after the Second World War, there emerged an idea called national science or decolonization of sciences. And this is the part of the history of science through these years. So let us understand what is the history of science. So science is a force for the good in society. The learning of history, what has enabled it to be such, will help us maintain its institutions and keep its social and economic benefits flowing. So science is for the good in society. We all know if there is no electricity, how world will be. So electricity is a science. It's a product of science. And knowing about the discovery or the invention of electricity helps us to know about the social and the economic benefits. The past system of science are valuable in themselves. This brings us the function of history that consists in recovery of the lost scientific knowledge. So again, history of science, it helps us to know the past. As you all know, if any scientific experiment has to be taken up, they will not do it just like that. They will go back to the past. What was what were experiments that were undertaken in this field previously. And they wanted to know about the input and the output of the past scientific experiments. So based on which they will carry out the experiment. So history of sciences helps us to recover the lost scientific knowledge. And Newton has quoted like this. If I have seen further, it is by standing on the shoulders of the giants. So this says the importance of history. Newton's quote, it clearly spells out the importance of history in the development of science. So what is the history of science? History of science is not a narration of chronological related facts, but it is a historical narrative of describing the process of evolution and the transformation of cognitive actions. So history of science is not a chronological narration of facts, but a describing the process of evolution and the transformation of human cognitive actions. So history of science, it describes the historicity behind experimentation and theories, which aspire to understand, apprehend, and intervene in the world from the perspective of scientific rationality. So what is the need for the history of science or the relevance of history of science? The historical study of science enjoys two great advantages over the studies of contemporary science. It encourages the study of long-term development process that requires decades or centuries to detect, and it permits the more confident identification of figures and episodes associated with scientific process. Suppose, if you want to know about internet is a technology or a science which is used by all of us today. But if you want to know about the internet, you need to know about the science behind internet. How to start with the process of semiconductors to chips, from chips to computers, and computers to interfacing, communication, and technology, how this internet has developed. So the to know about the present science, the history of science helps us to know the path in which the science development or the technological development has taken place. And it also tells us the story, how this progress took place, what are obstacles were there, and it also helps us to identify the leading figures who are associated with the science. So the history of science helps us to know about the contemporary science, its background, and its growth. So, historiography of history of science. So when you're talking about the history of science, it was evolutionary in nature. And the historiography of history of science, it had a different phase. Initially, it started with hagiography, like the biographies of the saints. So when the history of science was written, it was written in this fashion, hagiographics. An example of this style was Lewis Campbell's The Life of James Clerk Maxwell. So in this style, this is a style in which it was used like a person of ultimate knowledge, a person who has no flaws, like a saintly history. And this feels, initially the history of science, it was written on this fashion. But There were a lot of criticism for this because the person was portrayed as the person. And following this style of hagiography, there came up another trend in historiography in history of science called biographies. Stillman Dark's Galileo's biography. So this style was the second generation of historiography of history of science, in which they not only talked about the person, but also about the life, the events associated with the person. So Stillman Dark's Galileo, this book, it not only talks about the telescope, the invention that was made by Galileo, it also talks about the life and story, the trials and tribulations through which Galileo went through. And these are the two dominant historiography of history of science for a very long time. But after that, there came up another style called Whiggism. And this idea of Whiggism, it was propounded by British historian Herbert Butterfield. So what is this concept of Whiggism? So Whiggism is a biased approach to history, a writing that interprets past events according to present-day standards and perspectives. So writing history according to present-day standards and perspectives. And this aspect of historiography of science was followed for a short period of time. Then there was another important historiography of science as as positivism. And this concept of positivism, it was propounded by Auguste Comte. And Auguste Comte, he presented there are three-stage account of development of science. The first stage is theological, the second stage is metaphysical, and the third stage is scientific. Comte, he argued that human history was a chronicle of progress in an invariable chronological sequence. So Comte, he argued that human history is a chronicle of progress in an invariable chronological sequence. So later, there came up another person called William Whewell. So his ideas, it gave a lot of stress for the field of history of science. And it was William Whewell who first coined the term scientist in the year 1833. It was William Whewell who first coined the term scientist in 1833. So William Whewell, he wrote two important books, The History of Inductive Sciences of 1837 and The Philosophy of Inductive Sciences of 1840. So in this two works, he put a blueprint according to which the history of sciences should be written. So he said there are three stages. The first stage is the prelude, the second stage is the inductive epoch, and the third stage is the sequel. What is that prelude, the first stage? It is a period of fact gathering. That stage he called it as prelude. The second stage, we call it as inductive epoch, bringing together disparate facts through great discoveries. And the third one, the sequel, that is the last and the final phase. The discoveries were evaluated and accepted by the wider community. So William Whewell, he came out with a concept of three-stage writing of history of science, the prelude, the inductive epoch, and the sequel. And he was against Comte. He said science had not progressed by avoiding the search for causes, but in fact, its onward march was linked to creation of increasingly refined methods of discovering novel types of causes. So we all know, for a very long time, it was the geocentric theory, which was accepted by the scientific world, where Earth was at the center and the other planets revolves around the Earth. But after many, many years, this was replaced. It was started by Galileo, later Kepler and others. They replaced it with the concept of heliocentric theory, where sun is at the center and the other things, other planets revolves around the sun. So science is possible by discovering new factors and causes for an event. So by late 30s, there came up another approach called the Marxist approach to history of science. And this Marxist approach of history of science, they said the inventions in science is not just abstract, it is basically the socio-economic factors which determines the invention. So this approach, we call it as the socio-economic approach to the history of science, or the Marxist approach. So one of the popular proponent of this approach was the Soviet physicist Boris Henson. So Boris Henson, in his paper, which was written in 1931, The Socio-Economic Roots of Newtonian Principia. In this, he argued the history of science should focus on the social context and economic circumstances. So this Marxist approach to history of science had stressed on the social context and the economic circumstances. But the history of science had a solid ground with the work of George Sartre. So George Sartre, he's basically a Belgian historian, and he is considered to be the founding father of history of science as an academic discipline. And he was the first historian of science at Harvard University in the year 1935. So George Sartre, he wrote a good number of works. One of his most influential work was the Introduction to the History of Science, which consists of 3 volumes. And these 3 volumes put together, it runs to 4,296 pages. So in this 3-volume book, Introduction to History of Science, George Sartre, he reviewed and cataloged the scientific and cultural contribution of every civilization from antiquity through the 14th century. So this is a seminal document which was prepared by George Sartre, which covers the science and the cultural contribution of all the civilizations up to the 14th century. So, and George Sartre, he founded a journal called SS in the year 1912, which is a prominent journal in the field of history of science and technology. So for George Sartre, science was the totality of positive knowledge. So anything positive, we call it as science. And he argued, the history of science was the only history that can illustrate the progress of mankind. So if we want to know how human beings have progressed, he said, using the history of science, you can show how human beings have progressed. And we all know we started life in space, in outside, then we moved to caves. Now we have gone up to skyscrapers. So the history or the progress of man also said new humanism. He said, history of science has contributed and it has elevated humanity. So George Sartre, he was using this term, the history of science as new humanism, that the history of sciences has gone beyond, has crossed the barrier of nationalistic and religious differences, and it has brought civilization and it has brought people together. So George Satin, he has come out with a good number of quotes. I just want to highlight two important quotes of Satin. Men of science have made abundant mistakes of every kind. Their knowledge has improved only because of their gradual abandonment of ancient errors, poor approximations, and premature conclusions. So I repeat, it is from failure to success. That is what George Satin has inferred through this quote. And he also says, the history of science should not be an instrument to defend any kind of social or philosophic theory. It should be used only for its own purpose, to illustrate impartially the working of reason against unreason, the gradual unfolding of truth in all its form, whether pleasant or unpleasant, useful or useless, welcome or unwelcome. I repeat, this is a very important quote of George Satin. The history of science should not be an instrument to defend any kind of social or philosophical theory. It should be used only for its own purpose. So, and this idea was used for a long time, but in the year 1962, there came up a book by the famous American physicist and philosopher Thomas Kuhn. So Thomas Kuhn, in his monumental work, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. So in this book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, Thomas Kuhn, he introduced a concept. Now we know we are using a word called paradigm shift. Paradigm shift. And this term, paradigm shift, it was first coined and it was used by Thomas Kuhn in his book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. So in this book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, Thomas Kuhn, he argued the development of scientific knowledge was not continuous, but rather a series of profound shifts, which were the results of confrontation between awkward experimental facts and paradigms or theoretical frameworks. So I was just talking about the example of the geocentric theory and the heliocentric theory. So there is a complete shift from geocentric to heliocentric theory. So Thomas Kuhn, he said, the history of science or the scientific knowledge will develop not in a continuous way, but a continuous shift. There will be a profound shift. And he called this complete shift by a new terminology called paradigm shift. So these are some of the important path in which the history of science has come up. Now I will sketch up very quickly on some of the major historiographical trends on science and technological studies. The first major historiographical trend was nothing but the diffusionist model. And this model, it was propounded by George Bessel in his seminal essay titled The Spread of Western Sciences, which was published in the year 1967. So George Bessel, in his essay, he said, science was basically, it is for the Western nations. And it is from Western countries, science has diffused to other areas. And in this diffusionist model, he has quoted three models, three phases. The first phase is the diffusion process. That is, science from the imperial countries will come into the colonial countries. And the second phase, he called it as dependent science. There are some experiments that was made in the colonial countries with the support of imperial powers. So he called this phase as the second phase, what he called it as the dependent science. And the third phase is nothing but the struggle for nationalist science. So after a period of time, the natives realized that they had a very rich tradition, a legacy of science and technology, and they started to propound their own sciences. But this nationalistic science, it also used European ideas and theories to propound their science. So the first major historiographical trend on science and technology is nothing but the diffusionist model, where science, the knowledge of science was diffused from Europe to other parts of the world. And this concept, it was propounded by George Besseler through his essay, The Spread of Western Sciences, in the year 1967. And he talks about the diffusion model has three phases. The second major historiographical trend is nothing but the instrumental approach, science as a tool for imperial control. And this instrumentalist approach, it was propounded by many, but it was Daniel Hedrick. He argued that scientific knowledge and technology were indispensable tools of the empire. So with the help of science and technology, the European powers were able to withhold, were able to control countries. So he said there are a lot of technology which was introduced by the Europeans, and for example, railways, canals, these are certain technology for post and telegraphic system. These are certain technology which was introduced by the British in India. And we all know these were used as tools of the empire. It was used to control India. The third major historiographical trend is nothing but the post-colonial theories. In the post-colonial theories, Western sciences was seen as a form of cultural imperialism. Till up to the post-colonial theories, they saw science as a tool to control the political and the economic aspect. But the post-colonialists, they went beyond the field of economics, and they said Western sciences is a form of cultural imperialism, no less than a tool of economic exploitation and underdevelopment. There are many scholars who has propounded, who strongly argued on the post-colonial theory. So Ashish Nandi, Vandana Shiva, Claude Alvarez, these are some of the prominent scholars who strongly stresses that science as a form of cultural imperialism. And there is a fourth major historiographical trend beyond the core and periphery, networks and hybridization of knowledge. So the above three theories, it has some bias. Whereas this theory, that is the beyond core and periphery, that is network and hybridization of knowledge, in this theory, it talks about there was a give and take between the colonies and the imperial powers. And they introduced a concept called metropolis. So science, it was developed in the metropolis. From the metropolis, science was taken to other areas. But the science that was developed in the metropolis was not only the knowledge that was available at the metropolis, the knowledge that was available in the colonial area was also used by the metropolis to find this new type of scientific knowledge. So they introduced two important concepts called core and periphery. For example, if London is the core, Calcutta is the periphery. If London is the core, Calcutta is the periphery. So whatever scientific developments that takes place at London, it will come to Calcutta. But this metropolis is not something permanent. It was dynamic, it was changing. In Indian context, Calcutta became the metropolis, whereas Patna and other places, it became the periphery. So this model, beyond the core and periphery, where there is a network and hybridization of knowledge, this is the fourth major historiographical trend on science and technology. And Roy McLeod, Michael Warboy, Sujit Sivashundaram, Kapil Raj, all these scholars, they stress on this particular aspect of that is the core and periphery theory of history of science. So coming to the Indian scenario, as you all know, David Arnold, he is the pioneer in the field of science, technology, and medicine. So Arnold, in his work, Science, Technology, and Medicine, he says, science was at the center of British rule in India. And it is only because of science the British were able to control India. In India, the study of history of science, it was not given much focus till up to 1990s, because we always thought scientific knowledge is free from political influences, and there is no cultural connections. But after 1990s, there was a growing awareness among scholars, and they were able to identify that imperial interests is not only seen through politics or economics, but also through sciences. But imperial interests can be easily identifiable in economic and political arrangements, but in sciences it is not so easy. We need to decode the imperial interest from science. For example, we know one of the first observatory which was established outside Europe, that was nothing but the observatory at Madras. And this observatory, it was established by the British, not to observe, it was established to observe the weather and the climatic changes. But this is not for the development of India, but for their advantage. Because the coast, that is the sea route between Calcutta and Madras, was very rocky. So always there were cyclones in the Coromandel coast. So the British wanted to identify when the cyclones are coming and when the cyclone will hit the place, so that they can time their journey in the period when there will be no cyclones. So observatory was founded by the British in India, not for Indians, but for their smooth journey. And this cannot be identified easily, but we need to decode from it. So there are three generations of scholars. Some are of the view there were 5 generations of scholars who are identified with the field of HISTEM in India. So I will just make a quick run through of those scholars and their prominent works. The first generation of scholars were Dharmapala, Indian Science and Technology in the 18th century, Devi Prasad Chattopadhyay, History of Science in India, P. Ray and in India, whereas in the second generation, we have a very long list of scholars, starting from Ashish Nandi, whose work Science, Hegemony and Violence, Deepak Kumar, Science and the Raj, Dhruv Raina, Images and Context, the Historiography of Science and Modern India, S. Irfan Habib, Domesticating Modern Science, A Social History of Science and Culture in Colonial India, Shiv Vishwanathan, A Carnival of Science, Essays on Science, Technology and Development, Gyan Prakash, Another Reason, Science and Imagination in Modern India, Zahir Babar, The Science of Empire, V. Krishna, Science, Technology, Policy and Diffusion of Knowledge, Understanding and Dynamics of Innovation System in Asia Pacific, E.T. Abraham, The Making of Indian Atomic Bomb, Science, Secrecy and the Post-Colonial State, Richard H. Grove, Nature and the Orient, Environmental History of South and Southeast Asia, Parkit Chakrabarti, Western Sciences in Modern India, Kavita Philip, Satpal Sangwan. So these are some of the prominent second generation of scholars of HISTEM, and we have the third generation of scholars who are working in HISTEM, Jhan Pallavi, Meera Nanda. These are some of the prominent scholars who belong to the third generation. So talking about HISTEM, suppose if you're planning for a research on the history of science, technology, and medicine, what are research questions you will have? So first, how is that science managed to be what it presently is? Society, which have been the factors through which science became a valid instrument in order to understand it and measure it? What is the role of techno-scientific changes and developments in colonial process? What shape does modern and universal science take in a colony? To what extent were scientific discourses used to achieve political or economic goals? How was indigenous scientific traditions perceived, and how did indigenous people react or respond to introduction of new science? How colonial science became in colonial setting? What was the nature of relationship between imperial metropole and the colonial periphery? How far was the modern scientific knowledge in the colony, even though often was based on significant derivation from science in the metropole, was always sensitive to local conditions and willing to adapt, modify, and even sometimes deviate from their original Western epistemology on the concerned subject? So these are some of the questions which you can look into it when you work on history of science. So coming to technology, technology is a Greek word. Techie and ology. Techie, it means art. Logy, we all know it's learning. In technology, there are three important theories. The first theory is technological determinism. The second one is Scott, social construction of technology. The third one is ANT, actor network theory. So talking about technological determinism, the word technological determinism, it was coined by the American economist and sociologist Thorstein Veblen. So what is this technological determinism? So according to this theory, advancements in technology are the movements that bring on each new phase in human history. So it was technology which brings new phase in human history. That was the idea of this theory. So we know with the invention of wheel, mankind has moved, the story of mankind has moved tremendously. So it was the wheel technology which was responsible for the fast movement of mankind. The second important theory is Scott, that is social construction of technology. According to this theory, technology is shaped by social factors and forces. It was Baker and Pinch who were proponents of this theory called Scott, social construction of technology. You know, when automobiles was introduced in India, especially when they decided to introduce their cars in India, it was a two-door car. The car had only two doors. Probably if you can watch old movies, you can see the cars had only two doors. Through which, the person who has to sit at the back has to go through the front door. When this was introduced in India, the owners of Standard Motors, they went to England, they said, this model will not work out to India. And they were insisting for a four-door car. They said, in most of our women, they will sit behind. and they don't like to touch the driver or another person, because the driver will be sitting at the front or somebody will be sitting on the front. So they don't want to touch another person to enter into the back seats. So Gopala Krishnan, the owner of Standard Motors, he went to England and he asked Standard Motors to come out with a 4-door car. So technologically, it was basically a 2-door car, but because of the social factors, there was a change in the technology, what do you call it, just the social construction of technology. The 2-door car was changed to a 4-door car. And there was another theory called ANT, Ant or Actor Network Theory. So when the cars were introduced, it was normal. It was very steady. But with the coming of cars, many new changes takes place. You know, in rainy seasons, when the cars were introduced, but as and when people realized that there are many factors which is affecting their journey, then they decided to make changes in the technology. So technological theories, there are basically 3 theories. One is technological determinism. The second theory is social construction of technology. And the third theory is actor network theory. So when you're working on technology, you should use any one of these 3 theories as base for your work. So what are research questions you will ask in history of technology, especially during colonial period? What impact did colonization have upon the technological systems and capabilities of the colonies on one hand and colonized on the others? How did colonialism determine the transfer of mechanism? Did it mean geographical relocation of technologies, or could it encourage its cultural acculturation as well? Did British colonization accelerated India's fall, or did British presence, however inadvertently lacking its foresight, prepare what became in Indian hands a vital basis for later economic, scientific, and technological takeoffs? So these are some of the basic research questions you can ask when you're working on the history of technology, especially with reference to the British Indian period. How technological knowledge was generated, used, and transformed, and to whom. The third part of HISTEM is environment. So environment, again, it plays an important role in the colonial period, especially we have read in our economic histories the forest policies introduced by the British. So when the British arrived in India, Indian forests became, for the first time, the object of intense commercial interest. So under the colonial regime, scientific forestry, Indian scientific forestry was introduced. India's complex forest ecosystem was reduced to timber mine, whose prime objective was maximizing of exchange value on the markets through extraction of commercial valuable spices. So the same policy, the forest policy of the British, is still continuing even now. So when you are working on the environmental aspect of it, you should focus on how the colonial forest policies had an impact on the environment, not only the physical environment, but also the people who are living there. And we should also understand how the plantation, which was introduced by the British, had a serious setback on environment and the people of that area. So regarding the environmental history, there are prominent people who are working on this area: Ramchandra Guha, Richard Crowe, Madhav Gadgil, and Magesh Rangarajan. So they have come out with a rich scholarly work on the environmental history of India. So when you're planning to work on the history of environment, these are certain research questions which you can have. Can nature as an area of scientific research help historians understand the dynamics of the past? If so, how? How do environmental ideas emerge? Are they socially constructed, or do they emerge from the top as an instrument of authority and explanation? What impact did imperial expansion have on knowledge and use of natural science? How did they later shape the pattern of imperial expansion? As far as communities and environments destroyed in midst of European expansions. So these are certain basic questions on which you can work for the environment. So coming to medicine now, we all know this is an important and an upcoming field, medical history. So Singretz, who wrote the book, The History of Medicine, Volume 1 in 1977, he said, medical history will study the health and disease through ages, the condition for health and disease, and the history of all human activities that tend to promote health, to prevent illness, and to restore sick, no matter who the acting individuals were. Now, we are in a period of pandemic. So now when this started, everybody was talking about what is there any pandemic earlier? So there was a lot of news items about the Spanish flu. So medical history has taken an important place in the field of HISTEM. There are two important scholars who have worked on the field of colonial medicine. One was David Arnold, the other person was Mark Harrison. And David Arnold, he comes out with an idea that Western sciences colonized the body also. Whereas Mark Harrison, he comes out with an alternative theory that Europeans who came to India used their experiences to challenge the metropolitan authorities. That is, he says that there are certain knowledge which the Europeans, they got it from India, and they used to challenge the knowledge of the metropolitan, that is the knowledge that is available at London or so. So he says that the knowledge of the natives or Indian knowledge, it has an impact on the development of Western medicine. And now we all know this is true, that there is a group called the Wellcome Trust in UK, which funds a lot of money. Even Dr. Shiba was also talking about tribal medicines. Now, there is a lot of focus about indigenous medicines. And the history of medicine is one important area where all young research scholars can also look into this particular area. So when you are planning to take up research in the history of medicine, these are certain questions which you can ask for. How was healing practiced and who practiced it? How was disease perceived? So medical anthropologists have looked into the magico-religious rites, rituals, and shamans. Can this contextualized historically? Who are the grassroots healers? How did professionalism emerge? What were the counters of medical pluralism? How can one chart the interaction between the great and little traditions in terms of folk medicine and ethnohistory? How did the sick evaluate the doctors? How did the many distinct and competing practitioners relate to each other? What were the epidemiological consequences? What were the concerns for sanitation and public health? If it is public, then how public was public health? How did the colonial functions, what was the impact of colonialism on public health? Is there anything specially colonial about colonial medicine? So these are some of the questions which you can ask for. And there are many questions, especially what was the role of Indian medical services? What was the relationship between the European doctors and Indian assistants? So these are certain prominent questions on which you can work on for the history of medicine. But when it comes to HISTEM, there are certain barriers for the research in history of medicine. The first barrier itself is the mindset. Generally, it is believed in India that studying of science is an indicator of intelligence and success. And many were not happy in studying humanities or social sciences. So, And those who study subjects like humanities and social sciences, they are not considered uh, to be intelligent. Then science is considered to be a field of intelligence, and humanities and social sciences, to some extent, it was considered to be a field for the dull students. So how can you expect that both of them can work together? That is the number one question. And number two, there is no proper archiving policy in most of our scientific institutions. And even if there are some archives, there are two important private archives, the Tata archives, the Godrej archives. They have collected all their papers right from their start. But to get an access to these archives, it's not easy. And access to the archives is given mainly to people from the field of sciences or those who are closely connected to their families. For a historian, it is very tough to get an access into the archive. So these are certain research barriers in HISTEM: the mindset, no proper archiving policy, not having access to archives. But if you are planning to work on history of science, technology, environment, and medicine, you should go through the work of Professor Deepak Kumar. So his works are considered to be the base for this particular field. And he has come out with some of his inferences. So there are a lot of takeaways from Professor Deepak Kumar's work. I am listing out few takeaways. Colonization was possible due to the advancement of science and technology. So this was the first takeaway from Professor Deepak Kumar's work. So the British were able to consolidate their power in India mainly because of their advancement of science and technology. The second takeaway from his book, history of science belongs to the mainstream of socio-cultural debates in history. And he also talks about science wars, a concept called science wars. So many believe that the modern science is culturally neutral, universal, cosmopolitan, and it is humane. But it is not so. So there is a dichotomy, there is a rivalry between the modern science and the indigenous knowledge of the non-West. And thus we call it as science wars. And the most important feature of HISTEM, according to Professor Deepak Kumar, is thus HISTEM is interdisciplinary in nature. So if you're planning to work on the history of science, technology, environment, and medicine, you cannot just take up one particular area. You need to go through subjects like philosophy, physical and biological sciences, sociology, anthropology, and political economy. So HISTEM is a area which is interdisciplinary in nature. And he concludes like this: HISTEM can give us better understanding of colonial modernity. So scope for HISTEM, now we in the 21st century, we call this century as the century of the knowledge society. So everybody was talking about knowledge. Knowledge is, the base of knowledge is science and technology. And scientific temper is the need of the hour. The history of science ultimately aims to protect the heritage of local knowledge. This means that when scientific past of a region or a country disappears, the history of science recovers and finds practices, theories, proposals, achievements of movements and places with the intention of locating originality, innovation, and historicity knowledge at a specific time and place. So the best example was this, which was said by my co-speaker Shiba about the research work that people wanted to work on tribal medicine. And how nationalism and the gender dimensions are there in history of science. So Rahul Bigma, a scholar who has worked on colonialism and medicine, and he says Western science and medicine, through this, colonialism has consolidated its power in India. So if you want to know about the British imperialism in India, he says the best approach is to study colonial science and medicine. So I just want to conclude in the words of Professor Deepak Kumar. if there is a case or a need for an epistemological reunification of the so-called two cultures, that is science and humanities, HISTEM is the bridge. So if you are interested to know more about sciences, you can visit a place called the Science Gallery, which is at Bangalore. And this Science Gallery has 5 laboratories. A laboratory for natural science, material lab, food lab, new media lab, and a black box area where you can experiment on all areas. Yeah, because most of the time experiments, we always think experiments can be done only by scientists or people who had a very strong knowledge of science. But this Science Gallery at Bangalore is an open gallery where anyone can just go and carry out their experiments in the above 5 laboratories. So thank you so much.
Thank you, sir, for making us more aware on the path of history of science. Now the session is open for discussion.
Hello, sir.
Yes.
Sir, good afternoon. I'm Parvati and I'm doing post-graduation. Sir, my question is, when we say about HISTEMs, there is technological and environmental, and we are recollecting or finding the facts from past and how it's related to this. Sir, my question is, when we going for finding facts or when we going for the objective facts, especially like, for example, in environmental and how it's related to tribes. And for example, when we think about Bugyalas, which in the British colonial period, they were replaced and they considered as enroachers and offenders. So the facts we are getting from is the perspective of others, not from the perspective of inside facts we are getting. So if we start writing for that facts and we are finding for a validation, in fact, for finding fact from their point of view, then will it be like, so sometimes if we are going for folklores or sometimes we going for the stories, sometimes for poems and oral tradition, in fact. So when we come to this methodological thing, methodological aspect, will it be called as a, will it be like a struggle for validating our facts? Because the facts, the so-called facts, are constructive in a way that it from outside view. So if we want a fact from inside view, and we are getting those facts, and when it comes to the validation point, would it be called as a imagination of, or would it be called as just a part of oral tradition? Will it be like, is it like how to validate that? Because we know that they are not enroachers and it's their history. But when it comes to validation, would it be like we are evaluating the same age-old tradition of finding actual objectivity? So would it be is it like a conflict?
Thank you, Parvati, for raising this very important and pertinent question. As you said, there are two views, there are two sides of a coin. And as just the same, if there is an issue, there are two sides. As you said, rightly pointed out, the insider's view and an outsider's view. And most of the time, what happens is the outsider's view has been reflected in our books as research experiments. So the insider's view plays an important role to know about the real part of it. So in order to have an insider's view, as this particular field of HISTEM, I said it is basically interdisciplinary in nature. So if you want to work on a field of environment, because I know, like as the previous speaker was also talking about the tribal things, people will stay in some place and they say they'll be working on the tribals without understanding the socio-economic cultural condition of the tribals. It is not possible to work on the tribal history. So But we do understand eh, complete objectivity is not possible in any discipline or in any area. But objectivity can be attained to the max provided if we live with them. Or if you live among them or live with them. There are two important variables. These are two important variables. Live among them and live with them. So if you live with them, if we live with the environment, to some extent, it is possible that we can able to get a closer picture, not the picture, a closer picture. As you have said that oral traditions, there is a rich source known as the oral traditions. Now, most of the scholars, when they are working on any aspect of HISTEM, they are always looking to the oral sources. So oral sources plays an additional role in providing a pillar to HISTEM. But 100% objectivity is not possible if you are an outsider, but you can reach very close to the picture, but not the picture.
Thank you, sir.
Okay.
Any other questions?
Dr. Ashok,
Yes,
Shiba
ma'am.
here.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes,
Yes, ma'am.
it's a very interesting presentation, and I got to learn a lot from your surveys and all that historiographic narrative. I was just wondering whether you could also speak about the problematic nature of women with science in terms
Yes,
of
yes.
the practice, in terms of the establishments where women were kept out, or even in the whole pursuit of knowledge making, and also add readings of Maitreyi Krishnaraj and Neyman Worth, and somewhere also, please, I always appeal to people from science to please talk about
Women
the
in
ways
science.
in which it has
Yes.
excluded women. Yeah, thanks.
As ma'am had rightly pointed out, this particular field of wisdom, it has to be inclusive. It has to take in note of the natives. Among the natives, it has to focus to all the groups, and it should also inclusive in terms of gender-wise. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you.
So I think if there are no other questions, I take this opportunity to thank the School of Social Sciences and the Department of History, and a special word of thanks to my good friend, Dr. P. Jinimoon, the head Department of History, University of Kerala, for giving me an opportunity to share my views on HISTEM. But I do understand this is a very elaborate area which cannot be dealt with a very short note through an online. But I hope that I have done justice of the time and what I have been asked to do. Thank you.
Once again, thank you, sir, for introducing new horizons of historical methodology.